I'm speaking again with Yasser Munif. He's professor of sociology at Emerson College in Boston and active with the global campaign of solidarity with the Syrian Revolution. He'll be speaking in Old Lyme, Connecticut on Saturday, June 7th, in a program called Syria, We Want Action. Today I wanted to talk about al-Qaeda in Syria. We're seeing a story from the so-called anti-imperialist left that the U.S. is in alliance with al-Qaeda and that al-Qaeda was controlling eastern Aleppo until they were conquered. I'm thinking in particular of an article on Counterpunch by Chris Floyd who made these allegations. First, al-Qaeda is certainly fighting Assad, but are they part of the revolution in Syria?
No, they aren't, and they haven't been since the beginning. And since the beginning, they have been obviously a counter-revolutionary force. The fact that they have been fighting the Assad regime doesn't make them revolutionary. They're fighting the Assad regime for sectarian reasons, not for democracy or for any of the demands of the Syrian population. And they don't really care about the Syrian population or about the Syrian struggles or the demands of the protesters about democracy and freedom and dignity. They're more interested, obviously, in establishing an Islamic State and in imposing al-Sharia and making sure that Islamist groups, jihadist groups, are a hegemonic force in Syria. So they haven't been part of the revolution, but what happened in Syria and also in other parts of the Arab world is there are two wars that are operating at the same time. There is what's happening on the ground and the military confrontation between the various groups. And then there is a war of narrative and the war of discourses. And one of the things that happened in Syria is the regime interest in creating confusion, because obviously having to confront the civilian population and peaceful protesters would have been a lost battle for the Syrian regime. So the Syrian regime very quickly understood that it needed to create some kind of confusion and create various narratives, and it did that very skillfully. And it did that through different ways, by militarizing the revolution and creating this narrative about how violent the Syrian protesters are, and that they are backed by foreign forces and that are given weapons by various foreign countries and so on. And so,
tarring them all as Islamic fanatics.
Right, and very early on, the Syrian regime also labeled any opposition to its rule as Islamist fundamentalist. And even back in 2012, early 2012, there is an interview with Bashar al-Assad saying that 95% of the military groups are al-Qaeda, which is obviously and was not at all true. The al-Qaeda groups were really minimal, at most 5% of the military groups back then. So the Islamists and al-Qaeda have never been part of the revolution. On the contrary, there were two fronts against the opposition and the revolutionaries. On the one hand, there was the Syrian regime, and then the more cynical one was the Islamist groups and al-Qaeda, who was undermining all the civilian work and the institution that people were creating in the liberated areas by preventing them from going forward with the kind of democracy they were aspiring for, and dismantling any kind of secular institution and imposing al-Sharia and so on.
Mm-hmm. Now, so, I just want to talk specifically about flags, because one of the ways I think that the democratic opposition is smeared is is whenever there's some kind of atrocity or a charge of an atrocity, they'll put a 3-star flag up there. But from what I understand, I know ISIS won't touch a 3-star flag, but Nusra and the Islamists also don't use the 3-star FSA flag. Is that right?
For the most part, yes. They are against the flag of the revolution. They are against democracy. They are against the secular state, and most of them are sectarian. And their main goal is to fight a regime that is not Sunni, that Shia regime. They're not really interested in any of the demands of the protesters. So that's why they're not considered part of the revolution. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes the population in the liberated areas will accept them because of the coercion, and oftentimes they will kidnap activists or people who speak up against them. Mm-hmm. So it's because of fear that people sometimes will shut up and not denounce them openly. But I mean, there have been protests very early on and still ongoing against al-Qaeda in the liberated areas.
All right, now let's go back to Aleppo. Maybe a couple months ago, the special UN representative on Syria, Staffan de Mistura, said that there were 8,000 fighters in eastern Aleppo. About 900 or so were al-Qaeda. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the estimates. Others have provided other estimates saying that there were only 200 to 300 al-Qaeda fighters, and up to 9,000, mostly FSA groups in Aleppo.
But the so-called anti-imperialists just say, oh, eastern Aleppo, the al-Qaeda ruled, etc., etc.
Right. I mean, that's the kind of discourse that they have adopted, oversimplification of the Syrian conflict, and using some of the Syrian regime propaganda, and anyone opposing the Syrian regime becomes Islamist. It's almost like an Orientalist view or worldview of what's happening in Syria. So because those groups some of them are pious, because they are Sunni, they are branded as Islamist and as al-Qaeda affiliated. Whereas some of those anti-imperialist thinkers or intellectuals will never say the same thing about the 60-plus Shia militias who are fighting with the Syrian regime, and more than 100,000 national forces who are mostly sectarian and Shia, who are fighting with the Syrian regime.
Wait, let me go back. Let me emphasize that 100,000 are whom? Foreigners from Syria?
No, they are the NDF, the National Defense Forces, and so they're not part of the Syrian army. Mm-hmm. They are some kind of militias, but they're more loyal to the Iranian regime than the Syrian regime, because they are often given weapons and funding from Iran. So they're Syrian, but they are often selected and recruited in the NDF because of their sectarianism, and they're very much similar to the Iraqi militias, sectarian militias. So that's the status of the Syrian or pro-regime forces. They're mostly sectarian, they're mostly Shia, but you will never hear about that by the anti-imperialists, who are oftentimes tarnishing and denouncing the opposition and labeling them as Al-Qaeda, but will never say the same thing about Assad, and will portray Assad as, yes, totalitarian or despotic, but at least they will say he is secular, and right. He will back the minorities and protect the minorities and so on.
Let me finish with that one astounding claim by Chris Floyd in Counterpunch. He says the U.S. is in alliance with al-Qaeda in Syria, but isn't it true the U.S. assassinates al-Qaeda leaders from time to time in Syria?
It did, multiple times, and but I mean, again, they are projecting long-time history, and they are making references to the kind of alliances and that the U.S. Built back in the 1970s and 80s with the Mujahideen, and projecting that
in Afghanistan, not in Syria.
In Afghanistan, right, in Afghanistan, and transposing that to the present as if there is any kind of correlation between the two when there is none. So the U.S. has been very much opposed to al-Qaeda in Syria, and is actually also opposed to what Russia and Iran are doing in Afghanistan and backing the Taliban. Again, the anti-imperialists will never talk about how much the Taliban and the Russian are in bed, and how much backing military and funding they're getting from the Russian. But they will denounce the U.S. As the initiator or the force behind al-Qaeda in Syria, when there is no fact backing that at all.
Thanks. Why don't we stop here, and we're going to do another interview pretty soon. So I want to thank you again for talking.
Thank you.